The father's justice. I was standing in my kitchen when I signed the check. $68,000. Written carefully in blue ink. My hand steady out of habit rather than certainty. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than just numbers. Venue, catering, flowers, music. Everything Rachel had ever pointed at in those glossy magazines she used to leave scattered around the house. The late afternoon light slipped through the window above the sink, catching the edge of the counter where Eleanor used to stand, reminding me without asking that this was supposed to be a proud moment. I folded the check once, then again, pressing the crease with my thumb before setting it beside the envelope. For a second, I let myself imagine handing it to Rachel in person, seeing that smile she used to give me when she was younger, before everything became about plans and expectations and other people's opinions. Instead, I reached for my phone. She picked up on the third ring. There was noise behind her. Laughter, glasses clinking, music low but constant. It didn't sound like our house. It didn't sound like somewhere I belonged. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice even. "Just wanted to let you know the payment went through. Riverside Gardens is fully covered. You're all set." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. "Oh, thanks, Dad," Rachel replied, distracted, like she was already halfway into another conversation. I leaned against the counter, eyes drifting toward the check. "What time should I be there on Friday?" I asked. "For the rehearsal dinner. I can come early if you need help setting things up." Another pause, this one longer. Before Rachel could answer, a different voice came onto the line. "Hey, Thomas," Daniel said, smooth, measured, like he'd rehearsed this already. "Actually, the rehearsal dinner is just for the wedding party and immediate family. We're keeping it small, more meaningful that way." I straightened slightly, shifting the phone to my other ear. "Immediate family," I repeated, slow enough that even he would hear it clearly. "I'm her father, Daniel." "Right, of course," he replied quickly, though nothing in his tone suggested agreement. "But it's really just the people in the ceremony, bridesmaids, groomsmen, and the parents involved in the walk down the aisle. You know how it is." My gaze dropped back to the check on the counter, the number staring up at me like it had something to say. "I am walking her down the aisle," I said quietly. There was a brief silence on the other end, then a faint murmur, Rachel whispering something I couldn't make out. Daniel came back, just as calm as before. "Actually, we decided my dad and Rachel's Aunt Karen will handle that together. It just feels more balanced, given everything." For a moment, I didn't move. The kitchen seemed smaller somehow, the light sharper, colder against the surface of the counter. My hand rested beside the check, fingers still, as if I might steady something that had already slipped. "Aunt Karen," I repeated, more to myself than to them. Rachel's voice returned, softer now. "Dad, it's just how we want to do it. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal." I looked at the folded check, then at the empty chair across the table, the one Eleanor used to sit in, and I realized I wasn't being asked to show up early, or help, or even belong. I was being placed somewhere outside of it all. "All right," I said after a moment, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. And as the call ended, I stood there in the quiet kitchen, staring at $68,000 on the counter, trying to understand how I had just paid for something I wasn't even invited to be part of, or worse, when that decision had already been made without me. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there with the phone still in my hand, listening to the faint echo of voices on the other end, before the line went quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe Daniel had phrased it poorly, or Rachel would call back and explain it differently, so I dialed her again. She picked up quicker this time. "Dad?" I kept my tone steady, though I could feel something tightening behind my ribs. "Rachel, I just want to make sure I heard that right. About the ceremony, about who's walking you down the aisle." There was a small shift in the background, a door closing, the noise softening. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, more deliberate. "Yeah, we talked about it. Daniel's family is really traditional, and they thought it would be nice to have both sides represented. So his dad and Aunt Karen will walk me together. I turned slightly, resting my hand on the back of a chair as if I needed something solid to hold on to. Aunt Karen, I repeated, your mother's sister. Mm-hmm. She lives 3 states away. Rachel. I know, Dad, but she's still family. The words landed flat, like they'd been arranged in advance. I walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the backyard where the grass had grown uneven again. I made a mental note to trim it. Something simple, something I could control. I thought, I began, then stopped, choosing the words more carefully. I thought I'd be the one walking you. Another pause. It's not about replacing you, she said quickly. It's just, this way it feels more complete, like both sides are there. Both sides. I glanced toward the hallway, where a framed photograph hung slightly crooked on the wall. Eleanor was laughing in that picture, her head tilted back, sunlight caught in her hair, the moment frozen in a way that made it feel closer than it really was. She would have been there, I said quietly, if she could. I know, Rachel replied, softer now. That's why we thought Aunt Karen would make sense. She's, connected to Mom. I stepped closer to the frame, reaching up to straighten it without thinking. My fingers lingered on the edge of the glass for a second longer than necessary. Eleanor had stood beside me the day Rachel was born, her hand gripping mine, her voice steady even when everything else felt uncertain. Years later, we stood together again at a small school auditorium, watching Rachel cross the stage, whispering to each other about how fast time had moved. Somewhere between those moments, I had made a quiet promise, one I never said out loud because I thought it was understood. That was when the day came. I would be there beside our daughter, not in the background, not in the audience, but with her. I see, I said finally, lowering my hand. Dad, please don't make this a big deal, Rachel added, her tone tightening just slightly. It's just one part of the ceremony. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. My free hand rested against the edge of the table, fingers tapping once, then stilling. Of course, I replied. It's your day. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but not easy either. I just want everything to feel right, she said. I looked down at the floor, at the faint scratches in the wood from years of moving chairs in and out, from dinners and conversations that used to stretch late into the night. Right, I echoed. We said goodbye a moment later. Nothing dramatic, nothing raised, just a quiet end to a conversation that should have meant more than it did. I set the phone down carefully, as if any sudden movement might disturb something already fragile. The house felt still again, the kind of stillness that isn't peaceful, just empty. I pulled out the chair across from me and sat down slowly, my eyes drifting back to the hallway, to that photograph on the wall. For a long time, I didn't move, just sat there, trying to reconcile what I had always believed my place would be with what I had just been told. And somewhere in that silence, I found myself wondering when that place had changed, or if I had simply been the last one to notice. I sat at the kitchen table a long time after the call, long enough for the light outside to shift from pale afternoon to something dimmer, softer, harder to read. The check was still there, tucked halfway into its envelope, but my attention had moved somewhere else, to the small stack of papers I kept in the drawer beneath the counter. I pulled them out slowly. Bank statements, transfer confirmations, notes I had written to myself in the margins. I didn't usually look at them all at once. It felt unnecessary, almost uncomfortable. But that evening, I spread them across the table, lining them up with more care than they probably deserved. $15,000, the down payment for Rachel's condo. I could still picture the day she called me, standing in the empty living room with her phone pressed between her shoulder and ear, describing the sunlight coming through the windows. It's perfect, Dad. We just need a little help to secure it. A little help. I had wired the money that same afternoon, didn't even ask for details beyond the address. $8,000, a few months later. Credit cards, she said. Holiday spending got out of control. Her voice had been quieter that time, more hesitant. I told her not to worry about it, that things like this happen, that it was temporary. Then 12,000. Daniel's business idea. Something about logistics, online distribution, and projections that sounded convincing if you didn't look too closely. He sat across from me at this same table, sleeves rolled up, explaining numbers that seemed to move faster than they should. I remember nodding, not because I understood everything, but because Rachel believed in it. I signed that check too. There were smaller amounts scattered in between, 500 here, 1,200 there, a couple thousand labeled as unexpected expense or short-term gap. Each one had a reason. Each one had a story attached to it, told just clearly enough to sound necessary. I added them up once, just once. The total came to just under $110,000 over 3 years. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking softly under my weight. The numbers didn't feel dramatic. They didn't shout or accuse. They just sat there, quiet and precise, like they had been waiting for me to notice them properly. I rubbed my thumb along the edge of one of the statements, feeling the slight texture of the paper. At no point had I called it a burden. I hadn't kept track to hold it against her, only to make sure I could manage my own limits. Because that's what fathers do. Or at least, that's what I had always believed. You help when they need it. You step in before things fall apart. You make sure they don't have to carry more than they should, especially at the beginning. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about making things easier for her, about giving her the kind of start Eleanor and I never had. I told myself that every time I signed another check, I gathered the papers back into a neat stack, tapping them lightly against the table to align the edges. For a moment, I just sat there with my hand resting on top of them, staring at the grain of the wood beneath. Nothing about it had felt wrong, not when it was happening. But now, looking at it all together, I found myself wondering when helping had quietly turned into something else, and why I hadn't seen it sooner. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I had planned to, but because sleep had quietly let go of me before the sun was fully up. The house was still, the kind of stillness that made every small sound more noticeable, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I made coffee out of habit, not really tasting it, and sat down at the table with my laptop. For a while, I just looked at the screen without opening anything. Then I logged into my bank account. The joint account was the first one I checked. It had been set up years ago. Something practical, something simple. A place Rachel could access if she ever needed help quickly, without having to ask every time. I remembered explaining it to her, keeping my tone casual so it wouldn't feel like a big gesture. Just in case, I had said. The balance loaded slowly. $3,247. I frowned slightly, leaning closer to the screen. That didn't look right. I had transferred money not long ago, enough to keep that account comfortably above 20,000. I refreshed the page once, then again, watching the same number settle back into place. I clicked on the transaction history. The list unfolded in neat rows. Dates, amounts, short descriptions typed in plain text. $500, car repair. $1,200. Medical bill. $2,100, tax payment. I scrolled down further. Another withdrawal. Then another. Each one spaced just far enough apart to avoid attention if you weren't looking closely, all within the past few weeks. All while I had been writing checks, signing payments, and assuming everything was already covered. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, then moved again, slower this time. I checked the timestamps, the pattern, the way each amount lined up, with nothing I had been told. No phone calls, no messages, no mention of any of it. I leaned back slightly, the chair shifting against the floor with a soft scrape. The coffee beside me had gone untouched, a thin layer of steam still rising in the quiet air. It wasn't just the money. It was the way it had been taken, quietly, efficiently, without a word. At the same time, I was being asked to stay out of certain moments, to show up only where it was convenient, to accept decisions that placed me further and further from the center of her life. I scrolled once more, stopping at the most recent withdrawal. The date sat there, clear, unremarkable. I tried to match it to a memory, a conversation, a request, anything that would make it feel connected to something real. There was nothing. My hand moved to the edge of the table, fingers pressing lightly against the wood as if I needed to steady something that wasn't visible. The room hadn't changed, the same light through the window, the same quiet, the same familiar shapes around me. But the meaning of it all had shifted. I closed my eyes for a moment, not long, just enough to let the numbers settle into something I couldn't ignore anymore. When I opened them again, the screen was still there, the transactions unchanged, the balance exactly what it had been, and somewhere in that stillness, something inside me gave way. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a clean, quiet break, like a line that had been stretched too far for too long. I rested my hand on the laptop, staring at the account as if it might explain itself, and realized I wasn't looking at an emergency fund anymore, or even a shared account. I was looking at a pattern, one I had missed until it was already complete. I didn't wait long after that, just enough time to close the laptop and let the room settle back into its usual quiet. The coffee had gone cold, untouched, a thin ring forming along the inside of the mug. I pushed it aside and reached for my phone. The number for the bank was already saved. A short menu, a brief hold, then a calm voice on the other end. First National, this is Kevin. How can I help you today? I kept my tone even. Hi, this is Thomas Whitmore. I need to make a change to one of my accounts. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. What kind of change? I glanced toward the window, watching the light shift slightly across the floor. I need to remove an authorized user from my joint checking account. There was a pause, the soft sound of typing. All right. Can I ask who you'd like to remove? My daughter. Another pause, longer this time. Not surprised, just careful. I understand. I'll process that for you now. This will revoke her access immediately. Thank you. The keyboard clicks continued. Steady, methodical. I listened without speaking, my eyes resting on the edge of the table where the wood had worn smooth over the years. That's been completed, Kevin said. Is there anything else I can assist you with today? I exhaled slowly. Yes. I'd like to review any other accounts where she has access. We went through them one by one. Savings, transfers, automatic links I had set up without much thought. Each one was closed or adjusted, each step clear and final. When the call ended, I set the phone down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table as if precision mattered. For the first time that morning, my hands were completely steady. I stood there for a moment, then sat down again, letting the quiet settle in around me. It wasn't relief, not exactly, but it wasn't confusion anymore either. The phone rang about 20 minutes later. Rachel. I watched the screen for a second before answering. Hello. What did you do? Her voice came through sharp, controlled, like she had already rehearsed the question. I leaned back slightly in the chair. What do you mean? The bank called me, she said. They said I don't have access anymore, to anything. That's right. A brief silence. Then, why would you do that? I rested my hand on the table, fingers lightly touching the surface. Because I needed to. That doesn't make any sense, she replied quickly. We use that account. We have expenses, Dad. So do I. Another pause, shorter, tighter. You're overreacting. This is about the wedding, isn't it? I looked toward the window again, the light now brighter, more direct. No, this is about something else. Then what? She asked, her tone shifting, a hint of frustration slipping through. I let the question sit for a moment, not searching for the words, just deciding how plainly to say them. It means the bank is closed, Rachel. What is that supposed to mean? I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, measured, without raising it. It means I'm not an ATM. I'm your father. There was no immediate response. Just the faint sound of her breathing on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, I don't understand why you're doing this. I didn't answer right away. My hand remained still on the table, The room unchanged around me. The same light, the same quiet, the same space that had always been mine. And as I listened to the silence stretching between us, I realized this wasn't about whether she understood, but about whether she ever had. The silence didn't last long. At first, it was just a shift in her breathing. Then her voice came back, sharper than before. "You can't just do that, Dad. Not right now." I stayed where I was, one hand still resting on the table, eyes fixed on a faint scratch in the wood. I already did. "That money wasn't just sitting there," she continued, faster now. "We've been using it. We have plans, commitments. Daniel's business is still getting off the ground." I didn't respond immediately. The words came out practiced, lined up too neatly to feel spontaneous. In the background, I could hear something. A low murmur, like someone speaking just out of range. "You've always helped us," she added, her tone shifting slightly, softer but more deliberate. "You said you would. You told me not to worry." "I did help you," I said, "for a long time." "That's not the point," she replied quickly. "You don't just stop when things are finally starting to work." I leaned back in the chair, the legs making a faint sound against the floor. "Rachel, things have been starting for a while now." There was a brief pause, then a quiet rustle, like she had covered the phone for a second. When she came back, her voice had changed again. Steadier, cooler. "Daniel thinks you're overreacting," she said. "He says this is exactly what his family warned us about." I let that sit for a moment. "And what did they warn you about?" "That you'd try to control things," she answered. "That you'd use money to push decisions when you didn't get your way." The words didn't land as accusations. They sounded more like something repeated, something handed to her and accepted without question. I glanced toward the window, watching a car pass slowly along the street. "I haven't asked you for anything," I said. "I just stopped giving." "That's the same thing," she snapped. Another voice slipped through the line then, not clear, but close enough to recognize. Daniel, low, steady, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Rachel didn't mute the phone this time. "You're putting us in a difficult position," she continued, picking up his rhythm almost exactly. "We were counting on you. We made decisions based on that." "Decisions I wasn't part of," I replied. "That doesn't matter," she said, cutting in. "You promised." I sat still, letting the word hang there. Promised. "I said I'd help," I answered. "And I did." "That's not how this works," she insisted, her voice tightening. "You don't get to just pull back when it's inconvenient for you." The room felt quieter somehow, the kind of quiet that made every word more distinct. "For me," I said, "it stopped being about convenience a while ago." There was a short pause. Then her tone shifted one last time. The edge softened, but not in a way that felt sincere. "Dad, listen," she said, slower now. "We can fix this. You don't have to make it into something bigger than it is." I didn't answer. "You just need to put things back the way they were," she added. In the background, Daniel's voice again, closer this time, almost guiding. "And if I don't?" I asked. The pause that followed was longer than any before it. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Then you're going to regret it." I shifted slightly in the chair, my hand still resting on the table, fingers unmoving. "Is that supposed to be a warning?" "It's just a fact," she replied. "We'll handle this our way." The line went quiet before I could say anything else. I set the phone down slowly, the screen dimming as it touched the surface. The house remained exactly as it had been, the same light, the same stillness, the same familiar shapes. But the conversation lingered, not in what was said, but in how it was said. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet settle back in, I found myself wondering what exactly their way was going to look like, and how far they were willing to take it. 3 days passed without another call. I kept myself occupied with small things, trimming the edge of the lawn, tightening a loose hinge on the back gate, wiping down the kitchen counters even when they didn't need it. The house stayed quiet, almost deliberately so, as if it were giving me space to think without interruption. On the fourth morning, the doorbell rang. It was early. The kind of early where the light is still soft and uneven, stretching across the front hallway in long, pale strips. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door, pausing for a second before opening it. A man stood there in a dark suit, mid-40s maybe. Clean lines, polished shoes, a leather briefcase held neatly at his side. His expression didn't change when I opened the door. "Thomas Whitmore?" he asked. "Yes." He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a large envelope. "You've been served." I took it without speaking, the paper firm and slightly warm from his hand. "Served with what?" "A civil complaint," he said, already stepping back. "Details are inside." He turned and walked away before I could ask anything else. I closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place with a soft, final sound. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table, staring at it for a moment before opening it. The pages inside were crisp, cleanly printed, neatly arranged. Plaintiffs, Rachel Whitmore and Daniel Hayes. Defendant, Thomas Whitmore. I read the first page once. Then again, slower. Breach of oral agreement, promissory estoppel, financial damages. They were claiming I had promised to fund their honeymoon, that they had relied on those promises, that my refusal had caused them financial hardship and emotional distress. Amount sought, $25,000. I set the papers down carefully, aligning the edges without thinking. The room felt very still, the kind of stillness that makes even your own breathing sound out of place. My daughter was suing me. Not for something unclear, not for a misunderstanding, but for money. Framed in legal language, structured into arguments, presented as if it were a transaction that had simply gone wrong. I leaned back in the chair, letting the words settle without reacting to them too quickly. The shock was there, but it wasn't sharp. It was quieter than that, more like something shifting into place. The phone rang a few minutes later. "Unknown number," I answered. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Victoria Lane," the voice said, calm, measured. "An associate mentioned you may have just been served. Do you have representation?" I glanced down at the documents again, then back toward the window, where the light had brightened enough to fill the room evenly. "No," I said. "Would you be available to meet today?" she asked. "I'd like to review your situation before anything escalates." I paused briefly, not because I needed time, but because the decision felt clearer than anything else had in days. "Yes," I replied. "I can come in this afternoon." 2 hours later, I was sitting across from her in a quiet office downtown. Glass walls, clean desk, no clutter. Victoria Lane read through the complaint without interruption, her eyes moving steadily from line to line. She didn't react immediately. She just turned the last page, set it down, and looked up at me. "Tell me everything," she said. I folded my hands on the table, the surface cool beneath my fingers. And for the first time since the envelope had been placed in my hands, I realized this wasn't just about what they had filed, but about what they were expecting me to do next. Victoria didn't speak right away after I finished. She just reached for a pen, flipped open a legal pad, and drew a straight line down the center of the page. Her office was quiet in a controlled way, the kind of quiet that comes from intention rather than absence. Soft light reflecting off the glass wall behind her. A faint hum from the air system above. "Let's start with documentation," she said, her tone even. "Everything you've given them, every transfer, every check, every message, that explains why." I nodded. "I keep records." "Good," she replied, already writing. "We're going to need all of it." Over the next few days, I brought in boxes I hadn't opened in months, folders labeled in my own handwriting, statements stacked in order by date, printed emails clipped together with small notes in the margins. We spread everything across the long conference table in her office, the surface slowly disappearing under paper. Victoria worked methodically. No wasted movement, no unnecessary questions. She reviewed each document, marking certain lines with a thin red pen, placing small tabs along the edges so she could find them again without hesitation. 15,000 for the condo, she said at one point, tapping the page lightly. 8,000 for credit cards. 12 for the business investment. She moved to the next sheet. And the wedding, 68,000. I stood across from her, watching as the numbers formed a pattern. Not scattered anymore, not isolated. Together, they created something structured, something undeniable. What does it come to? I asked. She didn't look up immediately, just added one more figure, then circled the total. Just under $110,000, she said. The number sat there on the page, clean, precise, impossible to reinterpret. Victoria leaned back slightly, folding her hands. They're presenting this as a broken promise, she continued. But what we're seeing here is a pattern of financial dependence, possibly exploitation. I frowned slightly. Exploitation? You're over 60, she said. Widowed, living on a fixed income. They've been requesting and receiving money consistently, then escalating when access is restricted. That fits the framework of financial elder abuse. The words didn't feel dramatic. She delivered them without emphasis, as if she were stating something routine, something already supported by the evidence in front of us. So we defend the case? I asked. We do more than that, she replied, her voice steady. We respond to their claims, and we counter. We show the court exactly what's been happening. She gathered a stack of documents, aligning the edges with a firm tap against the table. This isn't just about whether you promised to pay for a honeymoon, she added. It's about whether they've been using that expectation to justify taking more than they're entitled to. I looked down at the papers again, the tabs, the notes, the total circled in red. For the first time, the situation didn't feel scattered. It felt contained, defined. Do you think they realize what this looks like? I asked. Victoria paused, then closed the folder in front of her. People in this position usually don't, she said. They assume you'll back down before it gets that far. She slid the folder toward me slightly, her gaze steady. The question is, she continued, are they prepared for what happens if it does? The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Low ceiling, muted walls, rows of wooden benches worn smooth from years of use. The fluorescent lights above cast an even, almost clinical brightness over everything, leaving no corner in shadow. I sat beside Victoria at the defense table, hands folded, listening to the quiet shuffle of papers as people settled into place. Across from me, Rachel and Daniel sat with their attorney. She didn't look at me at first, her gaze fixed somewhere ahead, posture straight, composed. Daniel leaned slightly toward their lawyer, speaking in low, measured tones, as if this were just another meeting to get through. When the judge entered, the room rose, then settled again, just as quickly. Their attorney went first. He stood with confidence that felt practiced, laying out the argument in clean, structured sentences. Your Honor, this is a clear case of reliance on repeated financial assurances, he said, pacing slowly. Mr. Whitmore made consistent verbal commitments to support his daughter's wedding and honeymoon. The plaintiffs acted in good faith based on those promises. He paused briefly, letting the words sit before continuing. When that support was abruptly withdrawn, they were left with obligations they could not meet, resulting in both financial strain and emotional distress. I watched him as he spoke. The way he glanced occasionally toward Rachel, the subtle nods exchanged between them, the narrative taking shape in a way that felt detached from anything I recognized. Then Rachel was called to testify. She walked to the stand without hesitation, her steps measured, her expression carefully controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried just enough softness to suggest restraint. My father has always supported me, she began. After my mother passed, he told me I wouldn't have to worry, that he would be there for me. She paused, her hands resting lightly in her lap. So when he said he would help with the wedding and honeymoon, I believed him. We made plans based on that. Her eyes lifted briefly, not quite meeting mine, but close enough to acknowledge where I was sitting. And then he changed, she added quietly. He cut us off without warning, It felt like everything we relied on just disappeared. The courtroom remained still as she finished. No raised voices, no visible reaction, just the weight of her words settling into the record. When it was Victoria's turn, she stood without haste, gathering a folder from the table. She didn't move around the room like the other attorney had. She stayed in place, her presence steady. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiffs have described a narrative of broken promises. What they have not addressed is the full context of their financial relationship with Mr. Whitmore." She opened the folder, turning it so the judge could see. "Over the past 3 years, Mr. Whitmore has provided approximately $110,000 in direct financial support, documented through bank records, transfers, and written communication." She moved through the figures one by one, each amount clear, each date aligned, each explanation grounded in something verifiable. There was no emphasis in her voice, no attempt to dramatize, just precision. "This is not a case of abandonment," she continued. "It is a case of sustained support, followed by a decision to establish boundaries. When I was called to speak, I stood and walked to the stand, the sound of my shoes against the floor louder than I expected in the quiet room. I placed my hand where instructed, then sat, facing forward. I didn't look at Rachel. "I never intended to harm my daughter," I said. "Everything I gave willingly, but there was no agreement, no contract, only help." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. When I stopped, it wasn't to punish her. It was because I realized I was no longer being treated like her father. The judge listened without interruption, her expression neutral, her pen moving occasionally across the page in front of her. When both sides had finished, the room fell into a brief silence, the kind that signals something final is about to be said. She removed her glasses, setting them down with a soft, deliberate motion. "Verbal expressions of support," she began, "do not constitute a binding financial contract, particularly in the absence of written agreement and in the presence of substantial prior contributions." Her gaze shifted toward Rachel and Daniel. "The evidence presented demonstrates a consistent pattern of financial assistance, far exceeding any reasonable expectation of obligation." End quote. She paused, letting the words settle. "This court finds no basis for the plaintiff's claim. The case is dismissed." A faint movement rippled across the room, not loud but noticeable. "Furthermore," she continued, "given the circumstances under which this claim was brought, including the documented financial history and the timing of the lawsuit, I find it appropriate to award legal costs to the defendant." Rachel's posture shifted slightly, the first visible crack in her composure. "There is also concern," the judge added, her tone firm but measured, "regarding the expectation that parental support is an entitlement rather than a discretionary act. That expectation is not supported by law." The gavel came down once, a single, contained sound. "Court is adjourned." I remained seated for a moment after everyone else began to move, the room gradually filling with the quiet sounds of papers being gathered, chairs sliding back, footsteps crossing the floor. Across the room, Rachel stood beside Daniel, their conversation low, tense, their lawyer already turning away. I didn't approach them. Instead, I stayed where I was, hands resting lightly on the table, watching the space slowly empty, aware that something had just ended, but not entirely certain what, if anything, would begin in its place. A few months later, the house felt different. Not because anything inside had changed, but because I was no longer trying to preserve it the way it used to be. I packed slowly, room by room, placing things into boxes without rushing. Books from the shelf, dishes I rarely used, photographs I paused on just long enough to remember where they were taken. When the real estate agent walked through, measuring spaces and taking notes, I followed at a distance, already letting go of decisions that once would have mattered more. I sold the house before the next season turned. The new place was smaller, a condo overlooking the river, with wide windows that caught the light in the late afternoon. I kept the furniture simple: one table, 2 chairs, a shelf for the things I chose to keep. Mornings were quieter there, coffee on the balcony, the sound of water moving below, people passing without knowing who I was or where I had come from. One evening, I found an envelope in my mailbox. Rachel's handwriting. I stood by the kitchen counter for a moment before opening it, the paper thin, folded once. Her words were careful, slower than I remembered, as if she had taken time to choose each one. She wrote about the wedding that never happened the way it was planned, about Daniel leaving not long after things stopped working in his favor, about realizing, too late, what had been lost. "I treated you like you were only valuable for what you could give," she wrote. And when that stopped, I didn't know how to see anything else. I read it once, then again, placing the letter flat against the counter afterward, smoothing the crease with my palm. I didn't reach for my phone. Outside, the light was fading, the reflection of the sky stretching across the river in muted colors. I stepped onto the balcony, holding my coffee, letting the air settle around me without interruption. Money can change how people see things. It can blur lines that should have been clear from the beginning, but it never creates respect. It only reveals whether it was there to begin with. I stayed there until the last of the light disappeared, the city quieting into something softer. The letter remained inside, unanswered. And as I stood there, watching the water move in the dark, I found myself wondering not whether I would forgive her, but whether she had truly learned what it means to value someone beyond what they can provide, or if that understanding would come too late.